Welcome, everyone. As one of our panelists just said, it's an amazing crowd for 9 a.m. on a Thursday morning in the summer. Of course, my response is it's been light for 5.5 hours. Welcome. I'm delighted that you're here. I've heard great comments about some people not having been in this space before, and you should know you're always welcome. I'm Frances Burnett. I'm the Provost and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs here at Illinois Institute of Technology. I'm an architect, I'm an engineer, and I am extraordinarily delighted to be here and welcome you. I have my own background as I'm from Montreal and New York, most recently from Oregon, and Chicago is extraordinary. So I see this as another great opportunity for collaboration and to look and see how all of our agencies can provide relevant and meaningful critical education and appropriate change. We're all part of a very comprehensive community with a mission of connecting to resources and knowledge and live in vibrant and sustainable communities. And what an incredible opportunity to be game changers and make this, as I will say over and over and over again, relevant. How do you plan, build, retrofit cities in sustainable ways and target the intersection of mobility, communities, business, and policies? And how do we all contribute to healthy communities? And why is this critical to us here at Illinois Institute of Technology to contribute to our institution's own education, to our education, us in leadership and on the ground? You think about architects, finance, industry, legal, people in development, in artists, planners, engineers, city managers, foundations, government, industry, all of us as partners. Illinois Institute of Technology's mission addresses using as its platform the global city of Chicago to provide distinctive and relevant education in an environment of scientific, technological, and professional knowledge creation and innovation. We're anchored in this very, very important community, that of this remarkable city. And Chicago and IIT can leverage these important partnerships. We are, I would say, just one partner in a crescendo of collaborations. And I'm sure you're well aware, if you have not been in this building, you're certainly aware that IIT is a private, technology-focused research university that has degrees, and we all know, in engineering and science. Probably some of you know in architecture as well and design, but we have business, we have human sciences, we have applied technology, we have law. And we're a rigorous institution with requiring very deep technological sophistication, innovative mindsets, and an entrepreneurial spirit. And this main campus, which we call the Meese campus, is only one of 4 campuses actually. And you know where you are. You're 3 miles south of downtown Chicago. It was designed by Mies van der Rohe, and this building that you're sitting in is designed by Rem Koolhaas. Interestingly enough, we are one of 2 campuses on the historic register, this one and University of Virginia. That would be because of, I don't know, some President Jefferson. This is, sorry, a little irreverence from a Canadian. So it's really appropriate that this conversation today is on our campus. Mies's work, Mies van der Rohe's work, exemplifies the intersection of invention, design, detail, and the future. For example, right a little bit west of here, if you get a chance, you'll see a construction site, which is the Ed Kaplan Family Institute for Innovation and Technological Entrepreneurship. And it continues our core philosophy, design, strategic thinking that addresses some of the biggest challenges that we all face. We established the Nayer Prize a couple of years ago, which we ran twice already, 2 $1 million prize packages established to encourage and challenge Illinois Tech faculty, staff, and students to develop breakthrough and innovative projects that with very short period, 3 years, would produce meaningful results with societal impact. Interestingly enough, one of our panelists right here, Marshall Brown, is an associate professor in the College of Architecture and a Nayer Prize finalist for his team's work on the Driverless City project. He's a recognized practitioner. You'll hear more about him later, and a scholar looking at urban design. And With that, of course, in order to have urban design, we also need to have transportation engineering research, and we have that. And it includes multimodal transportation infrastructure and dynamic traffic network mobilities, safety, security, emergency evacuations, as well as energy consumption and vehicle emission performance modeling. It goes on and on. We look at this across multiple domains, from business and finance to architecture and landscape. So Illinois Tech, we think, is a perfect fit to partner today and for a long time in the future with CMAP to co-host this conversation about innovation and planning for the region's future. In the academic arena, in intensive research institutions, we engage in both experimental research, implementation, and what I would call critical citizenship. And with that background, it is my great pleasure to introduce Chicago's significant citizen leader, Joe Szabo, Executive Director for Chicago's Metropolitan Agency for Planning. And as you all know, right, you all know this, Joe Szabo has experience in local, state, and federal governments, civic affairs, and transportation. And of course, I'm not going to give you all the background on CMAP. You'll hear about it today. But before CMAP, Szabo was appointed by President Obama as the 12th administrator of the Federal Railroad Administration. He began his public service as zoning commission member in Riverdale, Illinois. He is deeply vested in Chicago. He's held many, many posts demonstrating that. Another way it's been demonstrated is his honorary doctorate from Lewis University for his lifetime commitment to public service. And with that, please welcome Joe Szabo.
Well, thank you, Frances, and let me thank the Illinois Institute of Technology, our partner today in this Alternative Futures Forum. And I also want to thank all of you for joining us today in this conversation. Through long-range planning, CMAP improves the lives and economic prospects of residents in the 7 counties in 284 communities in northeastern Illinois. And for more than a year now, CMAP has been in the process of developing the region's next comprehensive plan, which we've titled On to 2050. Slated for adoption next October of 18, On to 2050 will be a data-driven, policy-based plan that will ensure the region maintains a strong economy and high-quality life. And the plan will promote an inclusive Chicagoland region that provides opportunities for all communities to participate in our economy. And this is economically good for all of us. To plan well for such a diverse region, it's important that we spend a lot of time listening to you and listening to the residents of our region. And so far, as part of our outreach, we've conducted more than 176 different workshops and talked to more than 46,000 residents. And our work is not done yet. Through August, we're continuing to do outreach focused on 5 of what we call our alternative futures. And each future describes a distinct set of factors that could significantly shape our region for decades to come. So those 5 futures are the impacts of a changed climate, impacts of trends towards walkable communities. Today's topic, innovations in transportation. Number 4, talking about constrained resources, particularly with the climate that we have in both Springfield and Washington, D.C. today. And then the 5th future is a transformed economy due to evolving technology. So you can learn more about how you can weigh in on any of these futures and the plan in general by reviewing the brochure on your chairs. As I said this morning, we're focusing on the question, as transportation technology rapidly evolves, how will we harness it to improve our lives, local communities, and the region's economy? For more than 200 years, transportation has shaped and reshaped the Chicago region many times, from canals to railroads to highways to aviation. And once again, I think we're at a pivotal moment. New technologies like ride sharing and automated vehicles are changing how people get around and how and where they choose to live. And so planners have many questions to grapple with. Preparing for this shift requires attention on nearly every front, from land use to workforce development. And so to get today's conversation started, I'll be turning it over to Andrea Haynes, editor of the Chicago Tribune Blue Sky Innovation section. And Andrea, CMAP and our partners have enjoyed Blue Sky's previews of our Alternative Futures forums, including the most recent article Q&A with Marshall Brown, who's one of our panelists here today. So thank you for that. Andrea has a number of questions that will kick off the conversation, and we encourage all of you in the audience to use the note cards that are on your chairs to jot down those questions and be a part of the process. CMAP staff will be collecting those, and Andrea will use those to form several of the questions later in the program. And so I know it's Andrea's job to introduce the panel, but I also do have to recognize my friend David Strickland. David and I served at USDOT for roughly 4 years, Dave? Yeah. Dave was the administrator at the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration during the same time that I was administrator at the Federal Railroad Administration. So Dave, it's personally great to have you here in Chicago. So with that, I'll turn it over to Andrea to start today's program.
Thank you very much. Do we have mics on here? Can you hear me? Okay, great. I'm going to pull it a little closer. Is that sounding good to everyone in the back? Okay, excellent. So yes, so I'm the editor of Blue Sky, which is a section of the Chicago Tribune. You can find it on their website, and you can go to it directly at blueskyinnovation.com. We cover Chicago innovation, entrepreneurship, and technology. So yesterday, as it happened, we were very busy with Uber and its news, which was, a nice lead into today. And I also just briefly thought this morning, when you have to navigate to a place in the city that isn't your normal morning commute, how nice would it be to have a car and driver? And that is exactly what we may have, as we'll discuss today. I was imagining getting into a driverless vehicle, punching in perhaps where I need to go, or just probably saying where I need to go, and then settling back with my notes to prepare and having it drive me here and park. So it's really, I think, fun to imagine some of these transit futures because they so connect to things that we do every day now, as well as being fairly mind-blowing about how they could impact our city and our own lives in the fairly near future. So I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves briefly. Marshall, as I mentioned, he's gotten a couple of shout-outs already, but I would really encourage you to read the Q&A we did with him. I'm sure we'll touch on some of those themes today, but it really does spark your mind to start thinking about some of these fascinating futures. So Marshall, would you like to begin? And then we'll go down the row, and everyone will tell you who they are to get us started.
Sure. If you haven't heard already, my name is Marshall Brown. Good morning and welcome to our campus. I'm an architect practicing here in the city of Chicago and also a professor at the Illinois Institute of Technology College of Architecture, where I work on lots of different kinds of things. In particular, I just spent the past couple of years working on what we call the Driverless City project at IIT, which is an interdisciplinary research project with colleagues from the Institute of Design, Landscape Architecture, Engineering, also law, working on this question of what, is going to be the future of urban space in the age of so-called driverless cars.
Thanks, Professor. I'm David Strickland, and I'm currently a partner at the law firm of Venable LLP in Washington, D.C. As Joe noted, I was the head of auto safety for the first term of the Obama administration, and it was during my time in public service where self-driving cars really came to the fore with Google's putting their project on Lombard Street in San Francisco in 2010. And just as a small aside, there's nothing better than getting a call from the White House, and I know Joe's probably had a couple of those moments too. You get a call from the White House asking, what do you know about this self-driving car driving by itself on San Francisco's Lombard Street? And nothing better than telling Rahm Emanuel, your current mayor, I don't know anything. And then you can only imagine what Mr. Emanuel's response back to me was when I told him I didn't know anything. And I know most people who know that Mr. Emanuel can be quite direct. I love Rahm, but that wasn't a happy moment for me. But with that, during my time, I issued the first self-driving testing policy in the United States, and really began working on connected vehicles and all those issues for the 4 years of my time running NHTSA. Now, in addition to my other work in privacy and data security, I also head a coalition called the Self-Driving Coalition for Safer Streets, which is comprised of Waymo, which was formerly the Google self-driving car project, Uber, Lyft, Ford Motor Company, and Volvo Cars. And those five companies, I should say, I apologize, are working on level 4, level 5 deployment, which is basically a vehicle that has no expectation that there's going to be a human being needing to intervene in the driving task. And how do you sort of resolve the numerous policy issues, consumer education issues, and access issues that go along with that. I am a lover. Chicago is my favorite city on planet Earth. I graduated at Northwestern in 1990, so any chance I get to come back to Chicagoland is a wonderful one, and thank you for the opportunity. Looking for a great session today.
Good morning. I'm Karen Tamley. I'm the commissioner with the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities for the City of Chicago. We provide direct services, disability awareness and education, and work on policy and accessibility compliance issues for the city. Transportation is a very big focus of our department, particularly as it relates to public transit, but also ride shares, and we've been working a lot on getting the rideshare companies to become accessible to people with disabilities. I also sit on the PACE board, representing literally thousands of eligible paratransit riders that are in the city of Chicago. I sit also on the RTA ADA Advisory Committee, and I was appointed by President Obama to serve on the United States Access Board, which develops accessibility standards around everything from public rights of way to transportation technology. And one of the things that we're very interested as a board talking about is the issue of self-driving cars and its relation to accessibility and people with disabilities.
Thank you. As you can see, this is a wonderful panel to have us contemplate what will be happening 33 years from now and how we need to prepare for it. So Marshall, I'm going to start with you, and if you could do a little of that scene setting for us and tell us what you think in 2050 will be the most different as to how we get around, what the biggest challenges there will be, the biggest benefits, and lay that out for us.
Well, it's a real challenge to actually look that far into the future and choose one thing which is going to be transformed dramatically, because what history shows us that when we have transformations in transportation technology, it actually changes the relationship between space and time. So for example, the city of Chicago owes its birth and its dominance in the middle part of the country and its size to the advent of the railroad. So that's a kind of close historical example. So you can imagine what kind of transformations this technology could bring on. That being said, among all the things we looked at, I would say parking. Parking, parking, parking. I can't ring that bell enough. Why parking? Because it's everywhere. It's ubiquitous. And a vehicle that can park itself really changes the game. It doesn't necessarily solve problems, right? But it changes the nature of the problem. We don't even know how much parking exists in the United States. Some estimates say 8 spaces per car. It could be as little as the size of Rhode Island. It could be the size of Vermont. But it's a lot of space. And so how all this space is used differently in the future, how it's reconfigured, where cars park, because it's next to every building, it's inside our buildings, it's on top of our buildings, it's under our buildings, it's everywhere in the urban landscape. So that's a huge one.
I regret now that I can't remember who did this. If somebody can shout out a credit, please do. But on Twitter yesterday, someone was circulating an aerial photo of the United Center and the surrounding area. Did anyone see that? Who was it? Oh, Street Block Chicago, okay. It was fantastically interesting, and I wasn't thinking of it until you mentioned that right this minute, but it was basically showing that it's a complete parking moat, they called it, complete parking, nothing but parking around the United Center, and just sort of raising the issue of, you can't really hang out there, right? You can't go there and eat and then walk right into the venue. You can't hang out after the game, and it really kind of amplified that in a very interesting visual way. David, do you want to continue on that and the 2050 sort of pros and cons, what you see happening?
Well, sure. I think the professor made an excellent point, and I think there's a number of cities, including the city of Beverly Hills, which is leaning in heavily to, frankly, changing its cityscape to, frankly, make it a driverless city. Really sort of taking out, dealing with not only sort of the parking, but street parking specifically, how you can sort of, frankly, you can recreate an urban landscape to really, frankly, reclaim some very expensive real estate and really sort of remake a city in terms of how we make it more livable. In terms of sort of looking out 33 years, I think I like to sort of chop it a little bit, because I think what we have to sort of build is a notion of ultimately of consumer acceptance. I think from a technological standpoint, we will definitely get to a level 4 or level 5 vehicle. I have no doubts about that. The technology is evolving very quickly, and as you're getting more testing miles happening. But at the end of the day, if people have to trust the technology, they have to be, frankly, build it into their lives. And, it could be, the model of what you're thinking about the 10th anniversary of the iPhone. In 2007, nobody thought about a little slate of glass in your hand, frankly, transforming the way that you interact with the world, and it really has. Now, probably everybody in this room has a version of that type of a phone. But the hope is being able to transform transportation so that we can either have higher use cases of a vehicle where, as opposed to a vehicle sitting around 95% of the time and only being in use about 5% of the time, you have fewer cars with higher utility, which again helps with congestion, thinking about parking. But I think within the near term, incumbent upon the manufacturers and policymakers is how do we build the case to make sure that people really do want to use the technology, and then making that technology, frankly, available to a much broader group of people other than current drivers.
Thank you. So Karen, continue on with that with an eye to making some of these new technologies affordable and accessible for a wide range of types of users in the future.
Sure. I guess I would just kind of back up and talk just for a moment about some of the challenges that the disability community has faced. Technology is rapidly changing in so many ways. It's liberated us. It's given us new opportunities to do business, to shop, all of that. But I think at the same time, we've certainly on the other side faced a lot of challenges with technology being accessible to people with disabilities. Again, with it being fast moving, we don't always think about how is this going to work for someone who is blind or low vision or deaf or hard of hearing or other disabilities. And at the city, we're constantly having new technologies come to us for review and finding this isn't that accessible to people with disabilities. And so I think that equity issue is really important to think about. Second, one of the things I see a lot in my work is just this digital divide in the disability community and how many people are coming to our office for services that are online, that are technology-based, in terms of being able to become eligible and sign up for services. And a couple of years ago, we probably saw over 1,000 people that came to our office because they either didn't have access to technology or they didn't have digital literacy skills to be able to really use that to access services. And then third, I would say just because technology might be accessible and available, it doesn't always mean that people with disabilities can use it. Again, going back to this accessibility issue, a lot of blind folks have in the past had issues with, transportation technology apps and making that usable for them. And then the affordability issue as well. We just see so many people in my work, my paratransit riders that are here in the city of Chicago, 70% who are at poverty level. Being able to access technology has certainly isolated them in many ways. So I think it's both sides for my community. It has this amazing potential to really, have us be independent and get access to our communities. But on the other hand, we still have a long way to go to get there. So I would say that, for technology, when it's being developed, it has to be accessible from the get-go. When you have to change things after the fact and make it accessible, it's expensive. It needs to be just part of doing business when you're developing a product or a service. And it's shown that accessible technology benefits not just those of us with disabilities, but every single person around. So again, I would just say that what's developed out there has to truly, truly be usable for everybody and truly engage the end user.
It's interesting, we've seen some small businesses crop up around doing things like that, trying to make something like Uber accessible to you, kind of becoming a middleman between Uber and a consumer who may not have digital access. So the private sector might also jump in a little bit on some of those solutions. Karen, you can start with this one, because one of the interesting debates that happens in looking at this future of transit is, does this future where maybe we don't have to drive our own cars, does that lead us to want to travel more? We can live further out from the city because we're not the ones behind the wheel. We can use that time productively. We can get goods and services even more than we do now with Amazon right to our door. Does it make communities, do we speculate, kind of want to travel more because it's easier, or does it require us to need to travel less because we can do more things simply from home or have them delivered to us easier?
I think it certainly reduces a lot of the transit-based barriers that people with disabilities face so that they don't have to travel, because I don't think we're there yet in terms of fully having all options for the disability community. Not all of our rail stations in Chicago are accessible. We still have 30 stations that need to become accessible. Uber and Lyft are very in their infancy, just starting to have accessible vehicles, but in most cities across this country, there's no option for a wheelchair user to be able to use that. And so I think until we address those barriers, technology is really helping fill that gap for people with disabilities in terms of doing online, grocery shopping, getting your goods, taking care of business from your home versus out and about.
David, your thoughts on that, the more or less travel?
Absolutely. Well, I totally agree with the commissioner is that, the difficulties for the disability community to be able to have, frankly, viable and thoughtful last mile solutions in transit is woefully lacking. And I think the hope is that, and I was the commissioner, we were talking before the panel, is that a number of these disruptive Silicon Valley companies like Waymo and even Uber and Lyft, as they're sort of thinking about building out a self-driving fleet, you build it from the ground up to be fully accessible, so that it is cheaper, it is frankly more available and is more efficient. But to directly answer your question, Andrea, I think ultimately, going back to consumer acceptance and saying that yes, I believe that this is going to be an amazing technology, it's going to have wide acceptance in the future. It's going to be that combination of policy push and pull that's going to figure out whether or not we're going to have a congestion ex-urban issue where now you don't mind riding in the car for an hour and a half or 2 hours because it's productive time or entertainment time, so then on your own. So you may have to start talking about things, especially like in Chicago, in major cities like congestion pricing, so that you are discouraging too many individuals, so you discourage individual trips in particular areas of high concentration so you don't have these issues. Or you're having to, change policies so that you don't have a self-driving vehicle drop you off and then circle the loop, in driving, just driving, picking you back up, which leads to congestion. So some of it's going to have to be a combination of responding to the demands of how the technology is being used and having the right policy solutions to make sure that you deter behaviors that actually may be impactful in a negative way.
One of the Twitter jokes I feel like we often see will be that a Lyft or an Uber, they've introduced various things where it becomes like, what we could do? We could have everyone wait for us on this corner, and then we could pick up 5 people there, and then everyone on Twitter jumps in and says, like, congratulations, guys, you just invented public transit, right? It's like, gee.
Exactly right.
There could be a schedule and a pickup point, and everybody could just gather there. So it's fascinating, I think, to see that develop. Marshall, I'll give that one to you, too. The frequency of travel, will it be more, less, or just different ways that we'll actually use transit to begin with?
The telegraph, the telephone, the television, the internet, the iPhone, not one of those inventions has reduced our desire to leave the house every day. Not ever, not once. And in fact, we leave the house more and more and more. Tourism increases, mobility is increasing amongst people around the world. So I think we can expect that trend to continue. People will still leave the house.
And hopefully make these in-person things like we're having today even more valuable, right? As we all get tired of sitting behind our screens all day. So one of the other fascinating things I think we see, and it does go to this issue of travel frequency, but also some other issues, is this casting of the future of transportation, particularly including the driverless cars or automated vehicles. and it's either the best thing that's ever going to happen to us or the worst thing that's ever going to happen to us. You know, it's utopia or dystopia, and The Atlantic actually has done a few interesting stories on this and posed one question about, like, you know, will it be a dystopian nightmare? Based on what we know today, which do we think? And I would add, is it necessary to cast it that way to begin with? You can start, Marshall, thank you.
No, it's not necessary, but it's also dangerous to cast it that way. It's a false dichotomy. The future is riddled with inconsistencies and contradictions. So my answer to all these questions, utopia or dystopia, will the robots take over? Will we control the robots? Et cetera, the answer is always yes. It's always both. Depending on where you look, there will be problems. There will be dystopic scenarios. There will be utopian scenarios. There will be, unfortunately, I could put it in the kind of capitalist language, winners and losers. There will be people that the technologies will work very well for and others that it won't work so well for. There will be people who get very wealthy. There will be people who will lose their jobs. Both of these things will often happen simultaneously, unfortunately, but I think the thing we have to be really careful about is saying that the technology will do these things. It has to be about us making choices about what we want our world to look like and then leveraging the technology to get there.
I think for the disability community, it would be utopia, because I think driverless cars will just open up so many opportunities for people that don't have access to cars now, people with mobility disabilities, people who are blind and low vision, people with epilepsy who don't have access to cars. And I think it can have other societal benefits in terms of potentially addressing some of the larger issues where transportation is the barrier, employment. There is a very, very disproportionate employment rate among the disability community. Only 35% of people with disabilities in Illinois are employed, as compared to 75 working age adults without a disability. And so, again and again, transportation has been identified as one of those barriers to employment. And I can see this, you know, really being just a new frontier in terms of independence of people with so many types of disabilities. I think the thing is the issue of affordability. Again, going back to this, our community being disproportionately low income, and how will that work? But it's something that's really exciting. I know a lot of blind individuals who are testing out autonomous vehicles, and it's something that we've talked a lot about at the U.S. Access Board as well. So I think it has great hope for people with disabilities.
I have a different perspective, and I am with the commissioner about it basically being more positive on the utopia side. And that's because we lost 35,092 people in traffic crashes in 2015. And 1/3 of those crashes were because of drunk drivers. I'm also, in addition to my day jobs, I'm also the chairman of the National Board for Mothers Against Drunk Driving. So when you're thinking about, you know, the dystopian, you know, impacts, at the end of the day, we don't talk about the top 10 killers of people in the United States. It happens every single year, that we have an opportunity to have an intervention technologically where we could get that severely reduced, and maybe in 30 or 40 years, talking about 2050 in the CMAP plan, you may have an opportunity that, you know, our grandchildren will say, I can't believe that anybody ever died in a car crash. And to me, that solution in and of itself bodes, frankly, the biggest positive benefit I think we could possibly have in this country.
Thank you. And I know one thing Marshall has said when he spoke to us that was interesting is I think when you think utopia, dystopia, you kind of just imagine jumping to that point versus the years that happen in the interim and the way that we impact what we let technology do in our lives, and the importance of us kind of being active in painting that picture and not necessarily just being the passive recipients of that picture. So Marshall, tell us, when we start to think about all these possibilities, what opportunities this brings us to redesign urban spaces. I know the parking is part of it, but taking it into the bigger picture, looking at Chicago, for example, what are some things we could see on a practical level as this, you know, major shift happens?
Well, I think one of the things that makes the city of Chicago unique in the world is simply its scale. You know, the city is over 200 square miles. It's a modern city. It's very decentralized. It's kind of polycentric city. There's downtown, but there are also other business and work centers. So, and I think this technology, and everyone doesn't like to hear this, is probably going to only intensify certain kinds of decentralization, because it's going to give people more, or it's likely to, I would say, give people more options about where they can live and work, which in many ways is really good. And so I think that Chicago is the kind of city where we can really explore the most, let's say, optimistic possibilities of what that could mean. Because there is the scale there. And so we can think about new relationships between the downtown and Schaumburg and Beverly, et cetera. And again, I know that especially in our fields of architecture, urban design, and planning, we are still fighting kind of the last battle of getting everyone back to downtown, getting everyone out of their cars, getting everyone on bicycles, et cetera, et cetera. But the robots are coming. Right? They're not just coming, they're here. And as it's been said, it's going to be extremely liberating for many communities who didn't have those choices in the past. Lower income, communities of disability, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think we have to start looking at that at scale, right? Across not just the city, but then the region, which is enormous. You know, what is it, 18 counties spread across 3 states? Right. So that's, again, it's about this kind of contraction of space and time. When we have changes in transportation technology, places come closer together that used to be farther away. And so we're going to be thinking in whole different ways about, you know, the relationship between home and work and school, et cetera. And that's going to take a lot of imagination.
I would just add on that, you know, again, every technology evolves and you find new problems, new issues, you know, starting from the iPhone, or even actually let's fast forward a bit to recent times, Facebook Live. You know, Facebook Live is a very liberating way for people to be able to instantly communicate through video to, you know, millions of people. Downside is you can have unfortunately, some really horrible things, you know, be, you know, frankly, you know, broadcast around the world without them stopping. So what Facebook is having to evolve. How do you intervene for those types of things? In self-driving, it's called edge cases. It's that you test a technology, you want to make sure that it works in every driving scenario you can possibly think of, but you're going to find a situation where the technology is going to fail. Then you go back to the drawing board, you address that edge case. It's addressed, and it's a constantly evolving notion of edge cases. So for being able to think about how this technology is going to ultimately impact and shape how we transport ourselves across regions, and circling back to my first comment, it's going to be edge cases for us even in society and how we use this technology. We're going to have unintended consequences. We're going to have utilization scenarios which actually have really negative impacts on other people. We don't necessarily get the distribution of resource to the disability community or to seniors, which is another huge group of people when they at the point where they can no longer drive themselves. And how do we make sure that we actually do have this technology pull and be utilized by those communities, which is probably going to mean, you know, thoughtful planning and also being able to make adjustments as we're making sure that we don't have any market failures in how we roll this technology out. You know, where you have the city planners and you have all the folks that want to use this thing, it's constantly being aware of how this technology is being used for good and for bad, and how we can ultimately spill our water, but how we can ultimately, you know, shape it so we do get the impacts of what we want and how we can use this.
Does anyone have any thoughts on jobs? Because I think that's one of, you know, we think about commuting, of course that leads us to jobs, right? Does this mean that we have more jobs centralized in cities like Chicago because people can live, you know, wherever they want, South Bend, you know, further out and easily come in every day? Or does it mean that we need less jobs, for example, headquartered in Chicago, because you could be based in, a smaller city someplace and people could Zoom their way to you. Do we have any thoughts on how, just where jobs are located and centered will be impacted?
I'll start off because one of the things I have to talk about a lot is job impacts writ large. And in terms of job location, that's once again, it's a to be determined, because while it may be a more comfortable experience to be in a level 4, level 5 car, you're still in a metal box for a significant period of time, and you may not have access to family members, to your community, your church. So while it might make it more pleasant, I don't necessarily changes the underpinnings of, frankly, what we want out of society. Oh, thank you very much. Actually, it's very self-contained, and hopefully I didn't get the professor, or it didn't get me, so I think we're okay.
But so let me just say, could that count as work time, though?
It could.
You know what I'm saying? Could that 2
sure.
hours there be part of your 8 or 9 hour day, and your 2 hours home is part of your 8 so ultimately maybe it doesn't subtract from the rest of your time?
It could, but it also means, but it's also the notion of telecommuting in general. I mean, really where you're talking about now, where there was this huge pull to be able to have your home be your workplace now, and I know there's kind of a mixed messages of how that evolves. But ultimately, I think the issue in terms of not so much where your job happens or how you're more efficient, I think it's ultimately the technology is going to change the nature of work, whether or not in the livery industry, how it's going to impact that, the long-haul truck driving industry, and frankly, what new business models are going to be created or impacted by self-driving. And I know that there's studies on each side that shows that it is a job creator. There's some that are concerned about how do we transition folks that are working in the driving trades and deal with that. Some are going to be a positive impact. Long-haul truck drivers, we actually have a deficit of 50,000 truck drivers right now, and we can't fill them. Current truck drivers are getting older. Folks aren't taking those jobs, so actually automation may actually help bridge that gap and make it more efficient and more sustainable. Now there's going to be, how you repair cars, how you do all these other types of things. So the question about, yes, there'll be increased productivity because you can, work while you commute. But I think there's a number of other issues that we'll all have to think about in terms of a job transition, and especially for those impacted folks that for self-driving is going to be important. And just to take a small note, from what the commissioner is talking about, I think the disability community is about 36 million people, plus or minus, across the entire country. 20 million of those folks are of working age. And then again, we're talking about the ability to be able to have the disability community be able to lean into the workforce and have those solutions, will also once again be another opportunity for us to broaden the job market. So there's lots of pluses and minuses on the job issues. It's just, once again, being aware of how those impacts are happening, and we can make sure we can encourage the right outcomes.
Thank you. So Karen, talking about Illinois and Chicago, who don't always have the money that we may think we need to do what we need to do in transit, let's talk a little bit about that. How, does technology help us with that? It obviously creates new costs, to build this, this hopefully utopia that we're talking about. Does technology save money for the government entities in certain ways? How does the finance fit into this?
Sure. I think that's a little bit of a tricky question. The thing that I deal with most is the issue of paratransit, which is the ADA required door-to-door service for people with disabilities that cannot ride fixed route service. I represent thousands of riders here in Chicago, and I think when we think about looking at other options to kind of fill in the gaps with paratransit, and we've explored a lot of options, I think it's difficult because you do have these very strict ADA requirements. You have to service within a 3/4 mile of your fixed route. You have requirements on on-time performance and, background checks and things like that it's hard to replace with kind of other more affordable transit services. But we are looking at ways that we can use technology to lower those costs. So like online booking, text, reminders that your vehicle is approaching, similar like what they do with taxis or ride share. Also, the utilization of taxi cabs now, we have a subsidy that the city, it's a city program funded by PACE, that you can use a taxi and you get a subsidy up to $20, which is huge for so many people with disabilities that might want to take a short ride to the store, but it's a $43 ride in a grouped shared paratransit vehicle. It gives you more kind of options to go day of or spur of the moment which paratransit doesn't offer because you have to call the night before in order to schedule your ride for the next day. So there's a lot of constrictions with this service that I think it's hard to completely replace it with a more affordable option, but there's definitely technologies that we are looking at to try to make it more efficient and thus more affordable. You know, and I guess I'm always trying to push people to other transportation options aside from paratransit, but again, I just would reinforce the same points I've made before, is that the affordability issue is huge. Paratransit's $3 a ride. That's a huge issue. Most of the people we're serving are on fixed incomes of $730 some odd dollars a month. And so you have to look at that, but then you also have to look at, you know, the options in terms of accessing alternative transportation for people with disabilities. So I think as we get more accessible rideshare vehicles, for example, as we get more accessibility with our fixed route system, I'm hoping we're going to see a shift of less usage on more expensive transportation options to options that are more affordable.
And how should we be thinking about that in terms of investing in transit technologies as government entities? Should we be aggressively investing in them? Should we be holding back on them, waiting to see what happens? You know, how do we think about how our governments should be leading on that?
Yeah, I think we need to be aggressive about that because that's part of my job at the city, is making sure that anything that gets developed or put out there for review by the city is accessible, including the ride shares. And that's one thing that we've really, really worked on, is getting Uber to have a fleet of accessible vehicles. I just used it last night and it worked pretty well for me, but we haven't scaled up to the point where we can still get a ride within 3 minutes like everybody else does. And so I just think we have to be constantly vigilant and really sending that message that what you develop from the get-go must be usable for everybody.
Marshall, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think from the public sector side, what would be better is to invest in the infrastructure, that the actual urban infrastructure that those machines inhabit. There's a lot of uncertainty in the technology, and it's moving very fast, much faster than government is used to moving. However, I'll give you an anecdotal example. At the corner of Ashland and Belmont and Lincoln, which is a big 5-point intersection up in Lakeview, there was just completed a very large new Whole Foods, right? I go to that Whole Foods, I go there on foot, and the impact has been instantly shocking because, surprise, surprise, there's a strong intersection between ride sharing and the Whole Foods constituency. But no one seems to have had the wherewithal to create a pickup and drop-off area in front of the Whole Foods. So that intersection has become terrifying, even more than it was before, almost instantaneously. And this is something that has already been happening, but we didn't look at the codes, the requirements in terms of picking up, dropping off, how we designed the sidewalk, how we thought about how people get in and out of the store with their groceries, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that the investments need to be made in places like that from the point of view of the public sector. Like, how are we thinking about urban space? Now, the bright side is that I think it's really not about what you add, it's about what you take away. So in a world where, again, you don't need, more people are using ride sharing, well, then you can start to reduce the parking requirements and reduce the size of the parking structure and shift attention to give that space to other things. How do you think about the sidewalk as a public space where people are hanging out and meeting? In a world where cars don't kill you, which is a future that's coming towards us, we can actually start to remove a lot of the barriers and obstacles and signs and traffic lights and other kinds of things that have cluttered up our urban space over the past century. And so I think actually the kind of win here could be about looking at all these kinds of things which we can start to remove from the urban landscape as well, which would be potentially an opportunity for even savings, making roads that require less maintenance. Less asphalt means less potholes, for example. Smaller parking lots, again, means less investment in paving, other kinds of things. Curbs are a big problem. right, for disability communities, for elderly people. There are all kinds of other issues. There's stormwater management, which is a big problem for the city of Chicago. Flooding, which has a lot to do with impermeable surfaces. So I think actually, for me, as an architect and urban designer, there are really big spatial implications and opportunities, which there's been a lot less discussion about because everybody is so fascinated by the machines.
I agree. I think just even preparing for this, I think that's been the really fascinating part of it. It's almost just you can set aside some time to sit and think about it because there's, which you of course do for your job, but for the rest of us or some of us, it's absolutely fascinating to just speculate out and just bend your mind about it. So let's talk about how Chicago is presenting itself as a leader or a laggard in terms of automated vehicles. There are areas of the country, you know, Pittsburgh is working with Uber, the Bay Area is doing some things, Portland just last week has approved some testing. Chicago, meanwhile, has, you know, there's an ordinance floating out there that would potentially ban autonomous vehicles, the idea that we don't want our city streets to be where these experiments happen. What do you all think about how Chicago's positioning itself so far and how it should going forward? Marshall and then David on that, please.
It's a tough one. So Pittsburgh is the example, right? A year ago, they were being hailed as heroes for kind of taking on the driverless thing very quickly, and then already they're being sold as a kind of cautionary tale because of issues, because basically they got in bed with Uber, and Uber's problems have been well publicized. So there are risks which are a real problem, especially in today's kind of risk-averse political climate. That being said, you cannot stop what's coming. So I think that what will probably have to happen more is that the public sector will have to collaborate, I think more, let's say, actively with, people like myself, or others outside the public sector who can bring a different kind of thinking to the table and who can conduct, let's say, research projects, experiments, et cetera, which maybe don't fit within the scope of organizations like CMAP or city planning, et cetera, because you all in the public sector have certain kinds of frameworks and obligations to the taxpayers, for example, that, let's say, make your work inherently beholden to things like data. But, for example, with driverless vehicles, there's not a lot of data out there yet, right? So how do you begin to develop strategies now for a very, uncertain future in which the technology is changing very quickly, it's moving in 10 different directions, et cetera. I think you have to then start working with people in the universities, in the private sector, et cetera. I think another thing we, again, have to look at is history. The trains were eventually developed by the private sector and then came into the public sector. I'm speaking about public transit, what we now call public transit. So whether it's the New York City subway or the L in Chicago. I expect that things like ride sharing, something similar may happen, right? That it will go from being a kind of privately driven project to eventually coming into the public sector. Like, why wouldn't the CTA get in the ride sharing business? The technology exists. So, but I think there are lots of great opportunities for collaboration to happen there because we can all do different kinds of things and bring different things to the table.
I think the professor captured it perfectly, and I think that jurisdictions around the country, it's a bit of an investment arms race. Everybody wants to be a part of this future because, frankly, if you are, the innovator of self-driving vehicles, and that is captured by your city or your state, you may, frankly, you have a vector into a technology and a manufacturing pathway which can generate, countless jobs and billions of dollars of revenue and tax revenue as well. So that's the reason why you see so much activity. And the professor's absolutely right. There's been some arrangements which have proven to be very beneficial and very successful. Some of them are a bit more trouble. But that's the nature of anything in this world. But ultimately, for the city of Chicago, and I do think that it's unfortunate, and also it's reality, that, you know, the political arrangements can sometimes prove to not inure to the benefit of a city and a region. And, you know, the ordinance that Andrea spoke of was, you know, driven by, you know, folks that want to protect delivery jobs in the city. And as we talked about it, it's an important issue, and we have to talk about it. But forestalling a technology which can mean everything for this region is not the answer. And I think that hopefully, my understanding is that ordinance really isn't going anywhere, and hopefully that's the case. And really the thoughtfulness of CMAP and other institutions in the Chicagoland will make Chicago, as it should be, as, you know, one of the three jewel cities in America, that we really do leverage this technology in a way that's thoughtful and provides benefit to the region.
And David, just for a quick second, think of, you know, from the national perspective, Chicago's reputation, because there's been a huge effort, of course, in recent years to market Chicago as a tech city, to try to, you know, win the fight for some of those tech jobs that are coming along and to retain the ones we have. How do things like this fit into that?
Well, I mean, basically, and I can tell you because I was having to work on the effort to deal with this ordinance, is that if a group of companies feels that a city government or a state government is frankly not accepting or not friendly, not necessarily you're going to roll over and just say, come on in and do what you want, but if you're not sort of being able to even sort of work through the issues of the questions with these companies, whether it's a current car manufacturer or a new disruptor from Silicon Valley, they're not going to come, because they figured there's other places we can develop and do this and without having these issues. So I think while I think the ordinance is a smaller problem, a smaller effort, but I do think that, you know, with the combined efforts of, you know, frankly, the university community here, you know, here within the area and the state, clearly CMAP and clearly the legislature, you know, there's an opportunity to build a partnership. And I truly mean partnership, not just, you know, throw the doors open, let everybody do what we want. I don't think that's anybody's expectation. I think that's how you continue to compete, and that's what it's going to be. It's a competition, you know, because California is working on regulations which may have some limitations now. Texas is working hard on it. You know, Michigan right now was actually trying to build a test facility at Willow Run. It really is everybody. You know, Boston is very involved in trying to sort of work through these issues. Chicago has to compete. And I think in some ways of looking at how these other cities have sort of approached it may be, you know, a possible pathways of how the city does, you know, compete thoughtfully.
Thank you. Karen, how far should Chicago lean in on these issues?
I think you guys said it really well. You know, I think looking for opportunity to make this happen, but I think you guys had a great explanation for that. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'm going to move to some audience questions, and if we get through those, we'll pivot back to maybe a couple of other topics we had. Continue if you have a question, wave it on your card. And I'm going to get to a few of these. You know, one that I know we wanted to get to was we've talked a lot about vehicles and how those would impact things, but let's talk a little bit specifically about bikes and pedestrians and how those fit into this autonomous vehicle future that we're imagining. Marshall, David?
Sure.
Yeah.
Professor, you can start if you want to.
Well, again, I think there's a great opportunity for pedestrians to reclaim a lot of the urban realm. Throughout history, until about 100 years ago when automobiles showed up, the street was actually a space that connected people. Now, in the United States at least, it's mostly a space that separates us. We could turn that around, which would be amazing. Bicycles, there was an interesting article, I think last week, about tests that have been done on bicycles. Apparently, the robots don't see bicycles very well right now. And so again, this is the utopia-dystopia problem here. For pedestrians, it could be great. For bicycles, they might be a problem. Why? Because bicycles move more quickly, they have a strange shape, they can move more quickly and more unpredictably. So there are gonna be some different challenges for different kinds of mobility and users, et cetera, in that space of the street.
I would say that I always think about this, Professor, when you sort of think about if you go to the older parts of Harlem and you see these massive sidewalks and really how, frankly, it is built for community and pedestrianism, and you've taken away from the road traffic. And so what helped happen, and part of it is from the automobile industry lobby and other folks, that they managed to, in other parts of New York City and frankly around the country, push that space side, reclaim it, and claim it for cars, which makes it very, a much more aggressive environment. And I agree with the professor, this is a technology that can help, reclaim that space, which is so important. In terms of bicycles, technologically speaking, like a lot of these things, those edge cases, the technology is going to get better, and it's going to be able to deal with bicyclists. But ultimately, I think long-term, it's actually going to be better for bicyclists, and this is why. At the end of the day, a self-driving vehicle is going to comport with not only with the rules of the road, but there's going to be more predictive behaviors. Because I'll be honest with you, there's lots of folks in cities that see bicycling as a problem, and they are more aggressive, and they don't necessarily pay attention to the protections that bicyclists have fought hard to get, like here in Chicago or in Washington, D.C., or take your pick. At least a self-driving car is going to be much more aware. It is going to be much less aggressive. It's going to give way. It's going to follow the rules of the road maybe better than a person who's in a hurry, who's going to impede upon a crossover, or impede upon a bicycle crossover. So I think long range, I think a self-driving vehicle will actually be a tremendous benefit to the cycling community, as the technology gets better.
And how does policy play into that? One of these questions from the audience is, what policies should we be thinking about now to prevent AVs from dramatically increasing sprawl and to help maintain walkable communities?
I'll go back to an earlier answer. It's going to have to be, which may be, in some situations may not be the most necessarily pleasant policies, but if you're going to try to discourage individual trips as opposed to, pushing down carpools and pushing down transit, you're going to have to build, some market signals to encourage the behavior you want, which could turn into congestion pricing, as in London, to say like, okay, if you want to bring your own vehicle in the city, it's going to cost you, some more resource. And there's going to be other policy directions to try to dissuade that expansion of urban sprawl. And I think also too, there's still an infrastructure question. You can't build yourself out of congestion. You never can. You increase road capacity, you end up with more vehicles. And I think that's not going to go away with self-driving to a great degree. So we're going to have to think thoughtfully about how do you find that right balance of having last mile solutions and innovation, but not sort of creating an undue burden, because driving gets a lot more pleasant, a lot more easy, a lot more simple.
Another questioner asks, how soon until we have completely driverless trains, both freight and passenger? Seems a safe place to start since they're on rails.
Well, I should defer to Administrator Szabo and positive train control as sort of the first beginning of that, and think about those things. The issue of automation writ large, I think, is really where your question is going, is that, aviation is basically mostly automated. Frankly, pilots have very minimal inputs until takeoff and landing. I think there's going to be a point in terms of once we get, the infrastructure, positive train control and other things to help support rail, you're going to have the ability to have, to not have, the train conductor having to manage the task. So I think you're going to see automation as in the reduction of, frankly, human error, which is throughout, multiple, industries, and how you sort of reduce that, whether it's in transportation or otherwise. But again, it's going to have to be proving out those use cases. So I think ultimately, yes, you are going to see automation probably having more impacts across a number of the modes of transportation, not just simply in driving or in aviation. Administrator, are you okay with that?
For those of you familiar with smart city infrastructure, which is basically nodes and sensors that are starting to figure out and quantify everything that we do, how does the creation of that change how we get around? Does that, they're asking from driverless cars to mass transit, wayfinding, how is the data that we're getting from that going to play in to these factors?
This is a complicated one, and there are different movements, right? There are engineers, colleagues of mine, who are very interested in putting sensors and digital technology into everything, right? Into every piece of concrete, into every corner, into every intersection, into every tree, into every lamppost, everywhere. to basically allow them to have a higher degree of control over and understanding of what's happening in the urban environment. If there's one place where, well, there's a few places where I would take positions, it would be against that. I would be against that approach to thinking about the idea of a smart city. I just came back from the old city in Marrakesh, in Morocco, and I think cities are already smart. So to call something a smart city is redundant. I also think, just from a practical level, again, the way that we operate politically in democracy and the way election cycles change and problems of maintaining even the infrastructure we have now, digital technology moves way too quickly. I mean, think about already in the past couple of decades, in every building, wherever you went to school or your home or your office, all those wires you put in when the internet first showed up, and then you took them out and you put in other wires or other appliances, or how many home computers you've bought, et cetera, now multiply that out across the urban environment. If we can't fill potholes, and again, I'm not trying to be pessimistic, but we have a challenge filling potholes, how are you going to update the software, right? Update the machines, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we have to be more clever. I think that the approach to automation that puts more and more technology into the vehicles, for example, is the approach that I would encourage. And again, it's going to be context specific. There might be cities in certain places in the world where you have a stronger public sector, where people are used to paying more taxes, et cetera, where they could manage a very kind of technology-heavy infrastructure, especially in downtown areas where it's very dense. But in the United States in 2017 and moving forward, I'm not that optimistic about that scenario. And again, it might make sense in certain, let's say, central business districts in Chicago or Boston, et cetera, but once you get out into the so-called hinterlands, right, and it snows, who's going out there to clean the sensors off? Just at a kind of basic level. So I think we have to be very clever and strategic about how we think about this paradigm of the smart cities. The technology companies will sell us as much equipment and software as we will buy, right? And they will tell us what we want to hear, right? Sorry, those of you who are sitting out there in the audience, but they will tell us what we want to hear in terms of this will solve all your problems. This will solve your disability problems. This will solve your crime problems. This will solve your income inequality problems. It will solve all your problems. That will be $100 million for the software. Thank you. Good luck. Right? I would caution against this approach, which has an old and big name, which is called technological determinism. I would caution against it.
I will partially agree and partially disagree with the professor. I think one of the last acts of former Secretary Fox of DOT in the Smart Cities Challenge is that basically laying out particular challenges that could be sort of dealt with by smarter or strategic placement of technology. In terms of not only dealing with transportation, but dealing with water, dealing with electricity provision. And there was a lot of really solid results that came out of that competition, which Columbus, Ohio ultimately won. But the other cities that invested into these plans actually benefited as well. So I totally agree with the professor in that wiring everything, I think, is over-engineering and very wasteful. But I think strategic building out of sensors in the right places in order to be able to drive outcomes and collect, actionable data is actually it can be long-term being a wise investment. Once again, as I said, I agree with the professor, being strategic. Yeah. I also agree with them in that the vehicles are going to be, frankly, foundationally the way that you're going to really deal with most of this innovation, because the vehicle fleet turns over once every 30 years completely. Vehicles are on the road for about 11 and a half years, and you're talking about 16 to 17 million new vehicles a year being sold. So that is a way that you can sort of evergreen sort of that process in a much more predictable way. And frankly, everybody is building vehicles presuming the same bad infrastructure that we have today, imperfect line paint, imperfect signage, all the things that they're building around having to function in the world they're living in. So I don't think, in terms of for automated vehicle policy, I don't think we're going to need to have to wire everything anyway. I think everybody's presuming it's not. But as we sort of think about long-term investment into the infrastructure, at the right places and the right applications, I think that, frankly, smart cities, lessons that we've already learned could actually be beneficial.
So we have two questions from the audience that I'm going to group together because they both go to the idea of individual cars versus sort of fleets, corridors, that type of thing. One is more of a hard-based question on, do you see a shift happening that looks instead at the mobility of a number of people through a corridor rather than fewer people in an individual car? Which I'm pairing with the more emotional idea of how do we combat the idea that people identify with their car, right? Maybe that's a problem for the car dealers that are telling you you are what you drive, and we need to market some new idea, but people think of it as an expression of themselves. It's honestly, there's something of a feeling of freedom of it, right? It's great to hit the road, you're behind the wheel, you're stepping on the gas. It's a powerful experience that's kind of maybe inculcated a little bit in who we are, or at least some of us are. I do think that's probably changing with generations. I'm not sure if millennials are feeling that as much, but I love to hit the open road on the weekend and hit the gas a little bit. So policy-wise and individual identity-wise, how are we going to deal with that?
Well, just very quickly, it is shifting. Millennials and frankly generations behind that. I have a 2-year-old son, and the notion of freedom is much more changed for frankly those people. They really do. Its ability to stay connected is frankly is the driving thing. I mean, even in terms of how they sell vehicles today, people are not as engaged on horsepower and all those other types of things. They're engaged about how well your vehicle interface is in terms of me being able to stay connected and be able to snap, tweet, post, whatever you want to do. So I think that's one aspect that the vehicles are going to be, frankly, more common platforms. It's going to be more based upon the competition of tech. I think as we're already beginning to see that now. In terms of individual, identity and how do you sort of deal with that, it's the United States of America. We're a cowboy country at the end of the day that really much sort of believes in this, in individuality. That's the reason why you have, states repealing mandatory helmet laws for motorcyclists because, you can't tell me how to protect my head. You have New Hampshire that refuses to have a primary seatbelt law. You have all kinds of stuff happening across the country depending upon the social mores of the particular communities. So there is going to be parts of the country that are probably not going to be as acceptive of versions of automation or self-driving. Look, in Cheyenne, Wyoming, I can't see a rancher saying, oh yeah, I can't wait to get in my fully automated F-250. It's just not going to happen. But I do think that in terms of in more dense urban environments, I think you are going to be seeing people willing to have the facility and the convenience of not having to either maintain a car, park a car, all those things that makes it more transactional, but you get to be able to do the things you want to do. So I think it's not so much a policy. I think market forces will frankly drive those behavioral changes in the places where I think it makes sense.
I think it's going to be kind of community specific. I think we generalize too much in this discussion and focus far too much on millennials because you're not going to be, 20 forever.
Right.
In terms of how people are going to use vehicles. So again, one of the big opportunities is for communities of disability. I don't want to speak for others, but I think that people with disabilities have, might want to have their own vehicle because they have specific needs and uses for that vehicle. I think elderly people, I'm really looking forward to the day when I may not have the discussion with my parents about taking away the keys. But I can't necessarily anticipate that they're going to be that excited about sharing the vehicle.
Yeah.
They would like to have a robot of their own, probably, that they know is going to be clean and it's going to have their stuff in it that they need and want, et cetera, et cetera. If you have a family with children, I think if you're, again, a contractor, you don't use your car just for getting around. You use it for storing your equipment, and there's security issues, all kinds of other stuff. So I think it's very community specific. And just because you use ride sharing doesn't mean you also don't own a car as well. Right. It's a lot of both and situations. So again, this utopia of fewer cars on the road, less traffic, I'm not betting on that as a scenario. I think in some environments that might be the case. But I think what we're seeing is an expanding range of choices about people's mobility and how they get around.
Yeah.
And someone else is asking, what maybe going to that, is sort of what do we anticipate that ratio might be of individually owned cars, more like maybe a fleet type situation, what the actual mass transit will be at that point. What do we think that balance might be?
Again, it depends on a number of factors, including, use cases, as the professor sort of walked through, consumer acceptance generally. I think there's going to be a lot of things that it will influence it. I agree that there's going to be certain communities that are going to need their own specialized and individualized transportation choices because of particular situations, whether, seniors have particular issues, or the disability community with a variety of issues which have different needs in terms of being supported. Ultimately, I think what the goal is going to be, as cities continue to have significant investments in transit infrastructure. I don't think everybody sort of talks about maybe transit goes away with cars being sort of the new transit. I don't think that's the case. I think there's efficiencies of scale and speed and congestion issues which are still going to be addressed by transit. I think there's going to be last mile issues which these vehicles can solve. But I think ultimately it's going to be a combination of utility and affordability. People that still, can afford their own vehicle will choose to afford their own vehicle. You also have a scenario where you actually purchase into, a share of a group of vehicles. Cadillac is doing this now, where for $1,500 a month, you have, frankly, your choice across the entire Cadillac fleet. So you may need, an Escalade over the weekend, and then you could trade it out for, getting a CTS in the city. So you have a number of business models which may transform this. So it's really hard to say it's going to be X% transit, X% cars, X% pedestrianism. I think it's ultimately going to be, how the marketplace wins out in terms of what the model that people are really going to shine to.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion in this whole field about how do we get more efficiencies. But I think actually what drives a lot of people's decisions is just experience. The experience of getting back and forth. If you're going to spend a lot of time commuting and moving from place to place, what's that experience like? So, many of us have probably already, like the initial sort of excitement about Lyft and Uber and ride sharing and all this stuff is worn off, and now we're like, wow, I'm really sick of listening to the driver's top 40 radio, right? Or the bad air freshener, or there's like crumbs on the seat, or these kinds of things. And so there are going to be opportunities now to up the level of that experience depending on your price point, et cetera, to customize it, to control it. That has, that's a real issue in the world of transit, is just experience. I mean, look at all of the news about what's been happening on the planes, right? And people are getting increasingly frustrated with just the experience of it. And so we will make more and more demands, and maybe it won't be so much about what the outside of your car looks like, but certainly about what the inside of it is like, what the experience is like of being inside of it. Why do people not choose to ride the bus as much, for example? And it's because of the experience, standing out in the cold and getting on the bus, and it's very unpredictable, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's not to be underestimated, even though it sounds like it's kind of selfish or bad or whatever, but it has real impacts on what kinds of choices people are, I think, going to make in terms of, whether I just roll the dice in terms of what kind of vehicle I'm in and I don't want to own or have any control over that, or there become different kinds of models or new definitions of ownership or sharing, et cetera, et cetera.
And that's something I think we already see happening, right, that Uber and Lyft are pushing with their commute services. But it's also like we talk about drivers and riders, and that line is really blurring, as you know. There's plenty of people that might drive Uber a few hours a week, Lyft a few hours a week. It really blurs that line even among who is a professional sort of car service provider and who's a rider, and people are both now, which I think is also very interesting. Someone is asking an interesting question that's maybe a little more near term. How do we, what's in store for mass transit, getting back to that, and how do we ensure efficient mobility in moving a lot of people at peak times? Not the empty vehicles, not the one-person vehicles, but really moving bulks of people in the way that we do today and will probably still need to.
I'll start, but I think this definitely sort of feeds into sort of the commissioner's wheelhouse too. I think really what you're talking about here is a much more efficient, once again, I think what people are sort of talking about from an engineering and urban planning standpoint is a much more sophisticated, much more efficient hub and spoke system for last mile solutions. So being able to use, as opposed to thinking about transitioning out of transit is frankly how these self-driving vehicles will frankly help support transit, so you can get to, the train system much more efficiently and thoughtfully, and having properly allocated ways to get drop off and then you feed into the system more efficiently, I think is probably really the way forward. I think a lot of folks, a lot of smart folks in transit are really thinking about how this works, and I frankly think that the companies are thinking about how to support this, because Uber and Lyft, I'll just say in Washington, D.C., I serve on the Washington Metropolitan Transit Board, and when we were having a Safe Track, it was basically we were having all the issues with Metro, and Uber and Lyft actually they were the substitution. In terms of supporting when you lost significant portions of the Metro, and I think that is I think a precedent for the model in the future, and how frankly rideshare and these things are going to integrate with transit and support each other. And I think it's going to be quite effective.
Yeah, I think, people talk about efficiency. For me, the issue is responsiveness. And the kind of glorious, and this is the utopian side for me, the glorious, not even future, but present that's emerging is a redefinition of public transit that has come to us through companies like Lyft and Uber. It's already here. Again, when people are going to work in a shared vehicle, even though they're working with a private, they're paying a private company, that is at least a kind of semi-public form of transit, which is much more responsive for people across the city, across economic communities, across different social spectra, et cetera. And I think that's actually wonderful when, you don't have to stand outside in the snow waiting for a bus that sometimes comes and sometimes doesn't, whether it be on the south side of Chicago or in the city of Detroit. So I think in a lot of places where, again, you have large-scale cities, right, where the distances between home and work centers or school, et cetera, are far, and you can now use smaller vehicles which are more responsive to people's needs and the times that they need them. So if I'm going to my restaurant job that starts at 5, but I don't get out until 1 when the train is basically not running, and the ride-sharing company can kind of step in and fill that last mile problem or the after-hours problem, I think that's fantastic. So now, don't get me wrong, everyone. I just got rid of my car. I ride the bus and the train and my bicycle everywhere. But, right, I look around the urban environment and see how things are changing, right? And I see how people are getting to work and home and to Millennium Park in new ways. And so I do not lament the demise of, the bus or certain bus lines, right? There is a future out there that is not the death of public transit, but it's a really reconfiguration of public transit. It's a redefinition of public transit, and I think that's how we have to think.
I want to go back to the issue that you brought up about people's experience and how that impacts it. This is something I see a lot in the disability community is while I'm pushing for people to get on fixed route, not expensive paratransit, so many people I talk to say they take it is because they had a terrible experience on fixed route, right? They didn't bring the gap filler, got stuck on the train or whatever. The bus, we had a big problem 10, 15 years ago with buses passing up wheelchair users because they didn't want to pick you up, or they would say, oh, my ramp is broken. And that was very real. I had that happen to me many times. Things have dramatically improved, but I see, even last night, I was down on the south side trying to get back from a meeting, and I called the wheelchair accessible taxi 45 minutes early that I needed a ride at 8. By 8 o'clock, I never heard from them. I called them back. We still can't find a vehicle for you. And so, those experiences change people's preference by kind of force, And it's hard because, for example, even Uber is just starting with accessible vehicles here. A couple weeks ago, I waited 30 minutes for an Uber. people without disabilities don't wait 30 minutes for an Uber, and how I'm going to probably think twice about whether I'm going to use that mode of transit. But then on the flip side, if I'm not using it, they can say there's no demand, so we're not going to continue to add vehicles, so it's not going to scale up like we need to get that down from 30 minutes down to 3 minutes. If you get what I'm saying, I just see how that issue of experience can really transform people's options, and then what transportation companies think about our own need of our own community.
Ultimately, the reason why Uber grew so quickly and frankly got too big to fail so quickly was because a horrible experience that people had with taxi companies around the country. It's almost universal complaints. And so I think the commissioner has an excellent point. Now, I totally agree with the issue is going to be use and scale, and how do we, get these companies to invest, and scale up so that it does really truly become a true competitor and a better experience for the disability community, seniors too, in terms of, grandparents, trying to get to individual places, a bank, doctor, whatever it is, and not having to deal with, long waits for taxis, long waits for whatever the case may be, for assisted living transportation, which happens as well. So it's a great point.
I have 2 more questions in my hand in 5 minutes, so I think we can do this. Number 1, how must zoning evolve for us to realize the benefits we've discussed, and what tools does the region have to actually make that happen?
So this is like a professorial answer. Zoning is a 20th century invention, right? We invented it to be able to manage the industrial city. Now we have the post-industrial city, and not just because of this technology, but because of many technologies. Let's say, I won't be so radical to say zoning is obsolete, but it's highly challenged. In the city of Chicago, we barely pay attention to our zoning ordinance. I think that's just, like, anyone who's ever done a development project here knows that. And so, because it's not responsive enough, it wasn't designed to be responsive to the kinds of ways, again, that we live and work, et cetera, today. We don't slaughter pigs in the middle of the city anymore. And that's something that, like, zoning was invented to deal with, to make sure that people weren't slaughtering pigs next to housing or a schoolhouse or church or things like that. So I think that we really have to rethink the DNA of our urban environment, which is the zoning and the codes in general, to address not only this change in our urban reality, but many others as well.
I'm going to jump to the next just so we can get it in. I'm sure we'll have panelists around for a few more minutes if anybody had something they didn't get a chance to ask. How can we ensure the safety component? How can we make sure the system cannot be hacked? The question of our time.
The answer is making us hardening, and you can never totally eliminate a cyber threat. I mean, you're talking about criminal enterprises that only have to be right once, while everybody that's in the space has to be right every single time. It's just simply not a sustainable model. The issue is, frankly, building redundancies within the systems. Like, once it does have an intrusion that was detected, how does it fail safely? How does it land safely? That's something that, frankly, all the companies are working diligently on now. My old agency, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, is working on, frankly, cybersecurity best practices. The National Institute for Standards and Technologies is also working on their cybersecurity framework. So the issue is going to be making sure that you separate, you design for safety, you separate critical systems away from vectors that can get into the vehicle, so that, okay, they might be able to get into your infotainment system, but they can't get to your brakes. It's those types of things that, frankly, that is work that the vehicles are working on right now, but ultimately it's being able to shut down and attack very quickly. There is an ISAC, an Information Sharing and Analysis Center, that's been created for the automotive industry, so they can share confidentially attacks that they've experienced, so that they don't get propagated. So a lot of work going on in this area, but I don't think there's anybody that can expect that a car there is an unhackable car. It's fantasy. It's the ability of how you address it once you do have an intrusion, and making sure that you don't have something that happens of scale that could be really dangerous to the fleet.
Thank you. So I knew going in this panel would be exceptional, but it actually exceeded my expectations. I hope you all feel the same. I thought they were absolutely fantastic. I hope this was helpful for you and thought-provoking. extremely thought-provoking. Thank you all for coming. Feel free to come up and chat with us, and thank you so much.
Commissioner, so nice to meet you.